Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the webinar on diversity and inclusion. And I must say evidence-based diversity and inclusion, because today we're going to look at some of the pitfalls that we have been noticing in both academic research and in the field regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI initiatives within large organizations. Basically, what it comes down to is that there is a lot of science that is backing this up right now, and that there's a lot of evidence that you can use to work from a starting point that is already grounded in science. And it will make for much more effective and efficient diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. If you would allow me to share my screen, we can get right into it. All right. So this is a large topic, but what I want to cover today in depth is the role of unconscious biases and unconscious bias training, often provided solution in the landscape of diversity and inclusion. So without further ado, let's dive right into it. And I want to start with a quote that has been resurfacing along the fields of psychology and behavioral science, and especially in the use cases of diversity and inclusion. And that is, if your organization is not actively including, there's a big chance that you are unintentionally excluding. So there's a huge psychological component to this topic. And before we dive into it, a short description of the agenda. We have diversity in the brain in organizations that I want to discuss. We're going into some of the pitfalls of unconscious bias training today, this very, very popular solution to diversity, equity, and inclusion problems. And of course, we're going to dive into a framework, an evidence-based framework, and a couple of techniques that you can use to kickstart your evidence-based diversity and inclusion practice in your organization right away. And of course, there will be room for Q&A, but those will not be recorded. All right, briefly about my organization and myself. So Nurified is a applied behavioral science consultancy, which means that we help organizations change and improve with insights from psychology and neuroscience. We're really aimed at bringing behavioral change as a corporate solution to a broad area of clients in finance, in technology, in retail, but also in fields like architecture and education. So as you know, the field of psychology and of behavioral science is huge. It's very broad, and we are drawn to every field where there is behavior change. So if you're dealing with any type of behavior change in your organization and you want to reach out to us, please do so. We're always happy to help. All right. So Nurified, as I said, is a behavioral science consultancy. My role in Nurified is to oversee the training and consulting departments and to make sure that we bring the best scientific insights in an appropriate and also understandable and actionable format to our clients. We do this through consulting, through training, and through research. And this webinar is definitely part of that. It contains a lot of the latest research that our team has been doing, and we try to bring this to you in an actionable format. So let's dive into it. What is diversity, equity, and inclusion? Well, to take a step back, this is something that has a broad definition, and a lot of people are varying in these definitions as well. But to make it plain, we would say that diversity is about variance, about organizational variance, and in race, but not just in race, also in ethnicity, in gender, in age, in cognitive or thinking styles, and a lot more. Because if there's one thing that we've proven with psychology in organizations is that diverse groups, but really diverse, so in all these aspects that I was talking about, often make for better processes, better decisions, and an overall better climate to work in. Then there's equity. This is something different. This is about fair processes that provide equal opportunity to everyone. So what is the architecture of your organization? How you treat people, the processes and systems around that? And how can you make sure that they are human-centric and as equitable as possible so that everyone gets the same opportunities and everyone gets an equal chance to grow? And then there's inclusion, which is about empowering all stakeholders. So there is actually not just employees, all stakeholders, to make sure that they feel included and they feel at home, that they feel involved at all times. And this is a science on its own, which is why this field of diversity, equity, and inclusion is so popular, so important, and also so grounded in science. So when we move on, I want to talk a little bit about the impact of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because, of course, this topic is not new. It's been around for a very long time. And there have been very many experts in this field, both in academics and both in real life applications, that have shown a lot of promising results. But on the other hand, there are also, because everyone is very enthusiastic about this, and they should be, there are also many initiatives that are not very grounded in science and that don't have evidence to rely upon. So these could take the form of workshops or trainings or mandatory courses. And what we see is that not all of them are equally effective, which is why this subgenre almost, if you will, of diversity, equity, and inclusion came to be, which is what I would like to call evidence-based diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what does the science tell us to do to make the most diverse, the most equitable, and the most inclusive environments to work in? And McKinsey, companies like McKinsey, Deloitte, and also academic companies like INSTEM have been researching this a lot. And they have found some quite hard data that build a solid business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you treat this like any other strategic goals, with evidence, with metrics that you track, accountability and ownership that you assign to stakeholders, then you can reach pretty significant results in productivity. We're looking at increases up to 35%. In innovation, we're looking at increases of innovation in organizations that take DEI seriously, that are up to 20%. And of course, also returns. What about return of investment? Of course, an organization-wide DEI program is going to cost something, but it's also going to give you a lot in returns, because the people that are working there are going to be a lot happier and a lot more productive, and also a lot more effective and efficient. So there is a definite business case that you can build around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that you can also measure. But would be my first advice to any manager or executive that is trying to bring diversity, equity, and inclusion, D&I, to the forefront of their organization. Make sure that you're measuring your progress. Treat it like any other strategic business objective. Switching from all these business objectives to what is my specialty, the brain, there is a lot to talk about here. But I want to outline a couple of key points about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the brain that are very important to understand. The opposite of inclusion would be exclusion. And what we find is that organizations in which employees feel excluded, especially over an extended period of time, have a health response, a brain response to that is actually similar to the physical stress response. So this is also something that we've known in psychology for quite a while. Exclusion, the feeling of exclusion creates physical discomfort, physical pain, and over time, physical illness. So if you're not working on exclusion, the first thing that you're going to see is that the people in your organization are just a lot less happy to work there. But you're also going to see this in the HR numbers, for example. There's going to be a lot more turnover. There's going to be a lot more illness within the company, a lot more absence. Another important thing is that in and out group thinking is automatic. Now, this is quite a deep dive, but if we're talking about exclusion, if we're talking about creating inclusive climates, we have to tackle this fundamental aspect about our behavior, which is that we think in groups and out groups. Now, this is something very human. We almost intuitively feel when someone belongs to the in group and when someone belongs to the out group. This is something that is evolutionary, very logical, but it dates back tens of thousands of years ago. But we still see this in organizational climates. It is hard to control because it's completely automatic. But what you see is that there are always little tribes forming in organizations. This is what we try to describe as small group behavior. And what is happening here is that organically, so when you're not doing anything, organically these groups are starting to form, which automatically means that there are also people that will fall in between, that will be excluded. So there's this very automatic process going on that is actually detrimental. Then probably the key point also of this webinar today is that unconscious bias hinders DEI efforts. So I'm not sure if any of you have heard of unconscious bias before. They are these patterns in our thinking and in our judgments that cause us to make small errors in our judgment, in our decision-making, in our behavior that are not corresponding to rational behavior. And these biases, they extend far beyond diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're noticeable in statistics, in mathematics. They're actually everywhere. There's bias in everything. But in DEI, these unconscious biases, like, for example, you might have heard of groupthink, can have a huge effect on the effectiveness of our DEI strategy. They can actually undermine the whole thing altogether if left unchecked. So let's dive a bit deeper into that. When you look at how unconscious bias is mitigated, and actually how DEI programs are formed, a lot of organizations are relying on this thing called unconscious bias training, or sometimes labeled diversity training, which is all about making people aware of the stereotypes that they might hold, the assumptions that they might have, and trying to create some type of awareness in which they can outgrow these tendencies. Now, you might hear me already being a bit skeptical about this, and that is true, because what we have seen when we look at the data, because we've been seeing unconscious bias training for almost half a decade now, and what we see is that there are definitely some good effects of most types of unconscious bias training. We see an increase in awareness of bias in gender, in race, and sexuality. We see support for these minority or disadvantaged groups, and we also see a lot of intention. We see that people notice that there is bias and they really want to act, make a more inclusive and diverse and equitable climate. But what we don't see in most unconscious bias training is structural and behavioral change. We don't see the actual changes in behavior and in structure that we need. Now, this is because you could label diversity, equity, and inclusion challenges as systemic problems. And systemic problems require more systemic solutions. So this is the problem with unconscious bias training. And if we hone into this a little bit more, then it's good to take a step back and clearly define what unconscious bias means in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because as I just said, it's a very broad topic. So we narrow down our definition to the use case of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Then you would say that unconscious bias in DEI would be beliefs, attitudes, and stereotypes that can lead to adverse behavior towards certain groups. So we have all these, and it's unconscious, right? So we have all these unconscious and automatic tendencies without having bad intentions that might just lead an organization and the systems of that organization to display adverse behavior to certain groups. So again, 99 out of 100 times, this is not based on bad intentions, but it's still happening because it's unconscious and it's a bias that is hardwired into our system. So we see this unconscious bias training as a mitigative tool that I think it first surfaced in the 70s already. So we did way back here. And of course, unconscious bias training has come a long way. My argument would be that we should update unconscious bias or UB training using the science of today, using what we know now. And starting with that, we have to look at the pitfalls. So what we see is that these types of trainings are not always evidence-based and metric-driven. So there is no evidence to support it. I mean, not always. And worse, there are no metrics. So it's impossible to get a baseline to see the effect of the training because they're not measuring. It's just a one-off event. So this is suboptimal when we talk about training. Oftentimes, there is no executive buy-in. So let me tell you, when we have a DEI strategy and we have to implement it, executive buy-in is the #1 requirement. And what we see is that it often becomes an HR thing or an L&D thing or a whole separate project altogether. Sometimes there is even a chief diversity officer that is taking care of this, and the other executives are not really minding it. This is almost a recipe for disaster. There has to be buy-in at the highest level so that there could be backing throughout the organization. Also, these unconscious bias trainings are too often focused on these subconscious stereotypes, these attitudes, these assumptions that we were talking about. But by bringing those to light, of course, you can maybe notice that you are also having these assumptions and stereotypes and that they might afflict other people negatively. But they are almost always fully subconscious or entirely unconscious. So what that means is that when you step back into real life, when the stress of everyday works hit you, you're not going to notice if you're displaying biased behavior because it's unconscious. It's hardwired into our brains, and a training is not going to unwire that. There's also a problem in helping people really understand how bias works. Now, this is a bit out of the scope of this lecture, going into how bias actually works, because it's a very complicated topic. But it's definitely something that should be brought across in these types of trainings or programs, because if you know the inner workings of how bias comes to be, and also how it modulates organizational processes, it's going to be a lot easier to spot specific types of biases in others and mitigate them. Probably the worst thing is that unconscious bias training also assumes that awareness is the solution. Now, don't get me wrong, awareness is incredibly important. If we're not aware of a problem, then we don't know that it exists. There's not even going to be a budget or resources to tackle that problem. But what we have seen from the data is that awareness is not going to make a difference. So it's a great starting point, but it's not going to make a difference in addressing behavior change. The last thing is about context. When you talk to any of my colleagues in the field that are behavioral scientists or psychologists, one thing they're going to repeat to you: context is key. Context matters. Context makes the difference. Now, these trainings often take place in the training halls. Maybe you go to a special location. It's going to be can be a great and fun time, but it doesn't zone in on the actual context that biases occur. Boardroom meetings, training programs, one-on-one conversations, but also leisure time activities with a company. These are the contexts that bias could occur. And if we're not actually mapping out those contexts, those systems, and trying to place systemic solutions within the context, it's going to be really hard to counter unconscious bias and also to set up and engage with our diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. So this is depressing. I mean, it sounds very depressing, but it's not like there are no paths forward. There's actually quite a clear path forward in terms of finding a solution to these biases that block all of our D&I initiatives. And the catch is, it is not about trying to change how people are or how people think or how people make decisions, because these are processes that have been hardwiring themselves over thousands of years. And a couple of trainings are not going to undo that wiring. But what we can do is we can create an environment, we can create a context in behavioral science terms, in which people are prompted to make better decisions. We can create environments, we can create processes in which people are nudged to display the right behaviors. So how can we become great architects of processes, of systems, of contexts that help people behave in a more equitable and more inclusive way? There are many frameworks to do this. An example you can see here on the right, which goes from cognizing, which is awareness, which is making sure that you recognize your opportunities, to searching what are the best opportunities and how can we apply them, to reconfiguring, which is about experimenting. How are we going to experiment with different diversity and inclusion initiatives, trainings, habits, systems that we're going to try to really embed into our ways of working? And how do we legitimize it? How can we make sure that if we have some good data on what works and doesn't work in terms of evidence-based diversity and inclusion, how can we make sure that the entire organization is going to apply this within their own context? So this is still a bit theoretical, and I want to make it more practical for you. Luckily, we are not alone as scientists in trying to come up with actionable ways, practical ways to cultivate diversity, equity, and inclusion within organizations. So I want to share a framework with you from ESS that goes into 4 segments in which diversity, equity, and inclusion are most key. And then we're talking about things like organizational culture, attraction and recruitment, screening and selection, and of course, promotion and retention. So these are all these areas where we see that there are lots of biases slipping in that are blocking diversity, equity, and inclusion. And instead of giving people trainings to help them think differently, we're going to dive into those processes and into the habits and behaviors around those processes and change them in a systemic way. We're going to give you a couple of evidence-based tips and techniques right now that you can hopefully immediately apply. So starting with attraction and recruitment, going to screening and selection, going to promotion and retention, finishing at organizational culture, we're going to look at some interventions. And this word intervention might sound a bit hectic, but it's all about just what can you do? What can you apply? How can you make science applied in such a way that's going to make a difference in diversity, equity, and inclusion? Attraction and recruitment is a great place to start. And this is where organizations often already miss a step by not showing that they have an inclusive environment or showing that they're planning to create an inclusive environment. And there are many ways in which you can do this, but the golden standard, which we see in a lot of organizations, is a diversity statement. Now, this is a narrative, a fact-based narrative that is being constructed at the highest level, that is really committing an organization to diversity and inclusion in a very actionable way. So they lay out the strategy in this statement, they set metrics, they set goals, milestones, targets. Again, treat diversity and inclusion like any other strategic business objectives. You are an executive, you know how to solve business problems. This is a business problem if you frame it like that. Another thing that you can do, and this is something extreme. There's an organization here in the Netherlands that has done this, not for diversity and inclusion, but for sustainability a couple of years back, is that they tied their executive bonuses to their sustainability targets. And you can, if you want to take this really seriously, you can do the same with DEI targets. You can say half of executive bonuses are going to depend on whether or not we will reach our DEI targets in the coming year or the coming 5 years or the coming 10 years. This is how you make an organization commit and also communicate their commitment. And this is how you attract people. This is, again, and this is not just how you attract people from smaller groups or groups that are mistreated or groups that label themselves as minority groups. This makes an organization more attractive for everyone, but it levels the playing field, which is most important when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, screening and selection. One step forward in the funnel of DEI. How can we make sure that we screen and select in a fair way, in an equitable way, in an inclusive way? There is a strategy called fact-based evaluation, and it features a number of tactics, some of which are based on the way that we interview in the first place. So what we want to do, if we want to be more fact-based, if we want to be more fair, is put the in-person interviews on ice, save them for later, don't discard them, but first use numerical assessments. Really make sure that you score candidates on their qualities, on their aspects, before you look at the entire picture. Because when you do that, you're very susceptible to a bias called halo effect. If you see one aspect that you really like about a candidate, it's going to overshadow in an asymmetric way the other aspects, and it's going to kind of tilt the balance in a way that is irrational and that will cause bias. So by prioritizing numerical assessments, looking at how they perform, what their skills are in comparison to others, you can make sure that you're not biased in interviewing, or at least less biased. Also, we have found there's solid evidence to support that if you hire or screen in groups, the idea that you hire in groups is going to make a lot more fair assessment than when you hire single individuals. Because when you hire single individuals, you will focus too much on traits, like, for example, traits that correspond with traits that you have, or you might value one trait much more over another. And this bias is something that we cannot undo. But when we go from individual to group, we see that these biases are a lot less persistent. So always try to screen and select in groups. And now probably the most effective tactic here is when you have those groups. So you have these 3 assessments of clients, of participants, and they're laying next to each other. And instead of going through each of them top to bottom, you go through each of them horizontally. So you are selecting for trait A in an employee, and then you see how person 1 does on trait A, and then you move on to person 2. How are they doing on trait A? And then you move on to person 3. How are they doing on trait A? And you do that for all the traits. So instead of going down the resume top to bottom, you're going down 3 resumes, but you're doing it from side to side. And this really helps put things in perspective and makes us a lot less biased in favor of one or the other participant. These are small and simple things that you can do. You can almost call them habits that will have a big effect on how inclusive you are in screening and selection. Now let's talk about promotion and retention. When you have the right people and you have a diverse group in your organization that is showing great results, you want to make sure that you are fair in helping them promote, helping them be their best, and also making sure that you keep them, that you retain them. Now we kind of tread into the area of performance management. And an important aspect to look at is to debias performance rating. Now, there's a very easy thing that you can do. It's almost a tip. It's almost a trick. What we've seen is that if evaluators use scales that range from 1 to 10 or 1 to 100, they have a bias towards the higher end, because 10 and 100 often are associated with excellence, or often associated with extraordinary qualities, which makes an asymmetry in how they rate individual candidates. So this 10, the 10 or the 100, is distorting our views of how to balance ratings. And believe it or not, there have been many experiments in which they swapped these 1 to 10 skills with 1 to 6 skills or 1 to 5 skills. And what we've seen is that evaluators become a lot more fair and a lot more nuanced in rating and in doing performance ratings, because this extraordinary and excellent 10 or 100 is out of the picture. It's become more nuanced. So, and again, experiment with this, right? It's not like these are not copy-paste solutions. If you want to experiment with this, try it small scale, look at the data, again, assign metrics, and gather the data, make a conclusion, and see if this is going to be a scalable solution for your organization. It's never a one-size-fits-all solution, but these are evidence-based tools that have a lot of potential to work. Then there is evaluation. A lot of organizations still rely on evaluation, and especially self-evaluation, which is something that is inherently biased, because you have people that are very self-enhancing and people that are very self-effacing. By nature, and this again, it tilts the whole scale. It doesn't make for a level playing field. So most organizations are already doing this, but if you can replace self-evaluation with something like peer evaluation with 360-degree feedback systems and stuff like that, it's going to be a lot more fair if you have a group of people rating each other and evaluating each other than if they're only evaluating themselves, because this again takes them out of their own bias. When we talk about promotion, there's a really promising and interesting intervention, which is called opt-out promotions. So we have a problem in promotions, and that is that there are certain groups that are a lot less likely to step up and claim a promotion when they think they earned it. And there are other groups that naturally feel more inclined to do so. So what you can do in terms of your organizational systems is have a couple of criteria that you monitor with your HR performance in everyone. And when you see that employees reach a certain cutoff score, so they're doing great on all this stuff, that they automatically qualify for promotion. And this doesn't mean that they're going to be promoted, but this means that the organization is going to reach out to them and say, you are doing great. Actually, you've ticked off all these boxes. You are qualifying for this promotion. Do you want it? So they have to actually opt out. They have to say no instead of I want it or yes. And this makes for a lot more of a level playing field. So you take everyone is eligible for promotion, and the ones that want it will have a lot easier time saying yes. And then if you have to step up, say that you earned this promotion and claimed it, because that is where these group differences matter most. Okay. The last one is about organizational culture, and this is more broad. These are more long-term interventions, and these are things that you definitely have to think about in combination with other strategic initiatives. How can you truly embed diversity, equity, inclusion in the culture of your organization? One of the aspects is about growth mindset. This is something that we recently did a couple of webinars on. We have a lot of articles on our website. We have a lot of case studies on our website, nurified.com, about the benefits of growth mindset, the benefits of believing that success is not about performance only. It's about growing. It's about learning and believing that you can change. If you communicate this idea from top down on management level and be serious about it, it's going to be a lot easier for all groups in your organization, no matter how diverse they are, to step up and to level the playing field themselves as well. Then you have to practice inclusive leadership. So this is again about role modeling as well. Who are the influential figures in your organization, the leadership level, and how can you really get them in close loops to signal, to role model, to display the behaviors that are inclusive? in meetings, for example, inviting other people to speak up, encouraging dissent, making sure that everyone has a voice. If the leaders are not doing this, no one is going to do it. So make sure that you as a leader practice these aspects and that other leaders are also trained and inclined to do so. And then again, and this is what I want to finish off with as well, you have to treat diversity, equity, and inclusion as any other business objective, which means that there are going to be a lot of metrics, there are going to be a lot of timelines, there are going to be accountability and transparency checks. You're going to have to measure along the way and assess what works and do this in an iterative way that you really find out what fits best for you. Just imagine if you roll out a new sales strategy, the reason that you're going to become great at sales is not because you have deep conversations about sales. It is because you have a process, you have accountability, you have metrics, you have checks, and you go on it step by step by step, and you become better. And this is exactly how you should treat diversity, equity, and inclusion as well, if you're serious about it. And if you're not, of course, focus on other business goals, but you'll probably see the differences in your organization. All right, so we have these interventions summarized for you. It's about showing inclusive environments. It's about fair evaluation. It's about being able to debias your performance rating and make sure everyone gets equal chances. And it's about embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion in your culture. So how to get started with this? Well, as I keep saying, measuring is key. So to make sure that you have an idea of what the current metrics, the current climate of diversity, equity, and inclusion are, I would highly encourage you to start taking some surveys, to start talking to people. You can download a lot of free resources on this online and to really get into it. This is something that Nurified as an organization can help you with as well. Feel free to reach out to us. We can help you assess where the growing opportunities of D&I are. We can help you make a plan. And of course, we can also execute it with you and we can guide you on your way. So please feel free to reach out. You can reach us at our website. You can drop me an email anytime. We are always interested in bringing you the insights from science that make for better organizations with happier people. And we'll continue to do so, of course. So that brings us to the end of this lecture and to the Q&A. I am going to close and end the recording now so that you can all answer or ask your questions without being in the spotlights. And for the listeners at home, thank you very much, and we'll see you at the next webinar. All right.